The pie sat untouched on the white ceramic plate. Apple cinnamon, still warm from the oven with a perfect lattice crust that someone had spent time crafting. The elderly woman kept glancing at it, then at her husband, then at her hands folded in her lap. She wanted to eat, couldn't, not with the tension crackling through the air like static electricity before a thunderstorm. Murphy's Diner, Highway 101, just outside Bakersfield, 1976. Tuesday afternoon, 2:30. The kind of place that served coffee strong enough to strip paint and pie that reminded you why diners mattered. Red vinyl booths patched with electrical tape. Linoleum floors worn smooth by decades of work boots and Sunday shoes. The smell of bacon grease and fresh bread and honest labor. Charles Bronson sat in the corner booth, back to the wall, eyes on the newspaper spread beside his untouched coffee, not reading, watching. The way a man learns to watch when he's spent years understanding that trouble announces itself in body language before it speaks. The elderly couple had been there when he arrived. Both Harold and Dorothy Martinez, married 52 years, both in their 70s. Harold's hands shook slightly from Parkinson's. Dorothy helped him with his coffee cup, steadied his fork when he ate, spoke to him in the gentle voice of someone who'd learned that love sometimes means becoming someone else's strength. They'd driven down from Fresno to visit their daughter, stopped for pie because Dorothy remembered this place from their honeymoon in 1954. Same red booths, same checkerboard floor, same sense of simple dignity that seemed to be disappearing from the world one diner at a time. Harold wore his best shirt, white cotton pressed sharp enough to cut paper, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with the scars of 40 years in construction. Dorothy wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself with pearl earrings Harold had given her for their 20th anniversary. People who'd worked hard their entire lives. People who deserved to eat pie in peace. The punk had walked in 10 minutes ago, 19, maybe 20, unwashed hair hanging over his eyes, torn jeans held together with safety pins, motorcycle boots that made too much noise on purpose, leather jacket covered in patches and studs designed to announce rebellion against everything decent and orderly. His name was Kyle Morrison, high school dropout, 2 arrests for vandalism, living in his mother's garage, spending his days getting high and his nights getting angry at a world that expected him to contribute something instead of just taking whatever he wanted. Kyle had chosen the booth directly behind the elderly couple, close enough to hear their quiet conversation about grandchildren and arthritis medication and whether they could afford to fix the transmission on Harold's truck. The kind of ordinary talk between people who'd spent 5 decades learning how to care for each other. Something about their contentment infuriated Kyle, their quiet dignity, their obvious devotion, their complete lack of awareness that someone like him existed, their assumption that they could sit in public and be safe, be respected, be left alone to enjoy pie and coffee and each other's company. The waitress was nervous. Nancy Rodriguez, 45, single mother of 2, working double shifts to pay for her son's braces. She'd seen Kyle's type before. Young men angry at everything, looking for someone weaker to take it out on. She kept glancing at the elderly couple, hoping Kyle would just eat his burger and leave. But Kyle wasn't interested in eating. He was interested in power, in finding someone smaller than himself, someone who couldn't fight back, someone whose fear would make him feel important. He started small, loud comments about the music on the jukebox, complaints about the service, observations about how this country was going soft, how people used to be tougher, how everyone these days was weak and pathetic. Harold and Dorothy tried to ignore him, focused on their coffee and their conversation and the pie Dorothy still couldn't bring herself to eat. But Kyle's voice got louder, more specific. more directed. "Look at these old fossils," Kyle said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear, taking up space, moving too slow, probably driving 5 miles an hour on the highway, holding up real people with real lives. Harold's hands tightened around his coffee cup. Dorothy's eyes stayed fixed on her plate. They'd lived through the Depression, through World War II, through decades of working and saving and building something decent. They'd earned the right to sit in a diner without being harassed by some punk who'd never worked a day in his life. But Kyle was just getting started. "Hey, Grandpa," Kyle said, leaning forward in his booth. "Maybe you should think about moving to the old folks' home. Stop taking up space meant for people who matter." Nancy, the waitress, approached Kyle's table. "Sir, please keep it down. These folks are just trying to enjoy their meal." Kyle looked at her with the kind of sneer that said he'd never worked for anything, never respected anything, never understood that other people had feelings that mattered. "Mind your own business, lady. I'm just making conversation." Nancy backed away. She had rent to pay, kids to feed, couldn't afford to lose this job by confronting a customer, even one who deserved to be thrown out on his ass. That's when Kyle stood up. He moved to the elderly couple's booth, slid into the seat across from them without invitation, close enough that Harold could smell the marijuana on his clothes, close enough that Dorothy could see the hate in his bloodshot eyes. So Kyle said, grinning, "What's it like being useless? What's it like knowing the world would be better off without you?" Harold's voice was quiet, dignified. "Son, we're just trying to have a peaceful meal. Please leave us alone." Kyle laughed. "Son, you're not my father, old man. My father wouldn't be caught dead looking as pathetic as you." Dorothy's hand found Harold's across the table. 52 years of marriage. They'd faced everything together: poverty, war, sickness, the death of their firstborn son in Vietnam. But this felt different. This felt like pure meanness for its own sake. "Please," Dorothy said softly, "we don't want any trouble." "Too late for that, Grandma. You got trouble the minute you decided to pollute my view with your ancient faces." Kyle leaned forward closer. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get up, walk out of here, and find somewhere else to eat your old people food. This is my space now." Harold started to stand, not from fear, from dignity, from 52 years of avoiding confrontation, of being the bigger man, of walking away from fights that didn't need to happen. But his hands were shaking, from Parkinson's, from age, from the simple unfairness of being threatened for the crime of existing while elderly. That's when Charles Bronson moved. Not fast, not dramatically, just stood up from his corner booth and walked over 3 steps, quiet footsteps on linoleum floor. Suddenly he was there, standing beside the table, looking down at Kyle with brown eyes that had seen everything and been impressed by nothing. Kyle looked up, started to say something, stopped. Something about the man standing there made words stick in his throat like peanut butter. Something about the way he held himself, the way he looked at Kyle like he was examining a broken toy. Bronson spoke, one word, quiet, directed at Kyle. "Move." Kyle blinked. "What?" "You're in my seat." "Your seat? This isn't your—" "Move now." Kyle looked around the diner, looking for support, for backup, for someone to validate his right to be there. Found nothing except Nancy pretending to wipe tables and other customers suddenly very interested in their food. "I was here first," Kyle said, but his voice had lost its edge, gone from threatening to petulant, from dangerous to childish. Bronson didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't negotiate, just waited, patient as stone, giving Kyle exactly 8 seconds to make the right choice. 1 second, Kyle looked at Bronson's face, saw something there that made him uncomfortable. 2 seconds, Kyle noticed Bronson's hands, scarred knuckles, working man's calluses, hands that had built things and broken things. 3 seconds. Kyle realized the entire diner was watching, waiting to see if he'd back down from the quiet man who'd spoken 2 words. 4 seconds. Kyle felt his tough guy persona starting to crack, felt like a kid playing dress up in his father's clothes. 5 seconds. Kyle noticed Bronson's stillness, the way he stood like he had all day, like time didn't matter, like he'd wait forever if necessary. 6 seconds. Kyle's survival instincts kicked in, some primitive part of his brain recognizing that he was outmatched in ways he didn't understand. 7 seconds. Kyle started to slide out of the booth, slow, trying to save face, trying to make it look voluntary. 8 seconds. Kyle was standing, no longer sitting across from the elderly couple, no longer invading their space, no longer in control of the situation. Kyle opened his mouth to say something, probably something about how this wasn't over, how he'd be back, how the old man with the scars better watch himself. But the words died when he looked at Bronson's face again. Bronson hadn't moved, hadn't changed expression, just waited to see if Kyle was smart enough to walk away or stupid enough to escalate. Kyle chose smart, threw a $5 bill on the table, grabbed his jacket, walked toward the door. His boots still made noise, but different noise, hurried noise, the sound of someone leaving before something bad happened. At the door, Kyle turned back. Last chance to save face. Last chance to prove he wasn't intimidated by some old movie star pretending to be tough. This isn't finished, he said. Bronson looked at him across the diner. Yes, it is. 2 words delivered with absolute certainty. Not a threat, just a fact. The way you might say sky is blue or water is wet, simple truth that didn't require elaboration. Kyle left. Door swung shut behind him. Motorcycle roared to life in the parking lot, faded into distance. The diner stayed quiet for a moment, processing what had just happened. 8 seconds from confrontation to resolution. 8 seconds to show Kyle what real authority looked like. Bronson turned to the elderly couple. Harold and Dorothy were holding hands across the table, looking at him with something between gratitude and disbelief. "You folks okay?" Harold nodded. "Thank you, we thank you." Dorothy's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Bronson slid into the booth where Kyle had been sitting, not presumptuous, just present, available if they wanted company, ready to leave if they preferred privacy. "I'm Charles," he said. "Harold Martinez. This is my wife, Dorothy. Pleasure to meet you." Dorothy picked up her fork, cut a piece of pie, ate it slowly, first bite she'd been able to take since Kyle walked in. The fear was gone, replaced by something warmer, safer. "Are you—" Harold hesitated. "Are you Charles Bronson, the actor?" "I am. We've seen your movies. Dorothy loves The Magnificent Seven." Bronson smiled. "Good film, good people to work with." They talked for 20 minutes about movies and grandchildren and Harold's years in construction, about Dorothy's sewing and their daughter in Bakersfield, and whether the pie was as good as Dorothy remembered from 1954. Normal conversation between normal people. No mention of what had just happened. No rehashing of Kyle's threats or Bronson's intervention, just the kind of talk that happens when decent people recognize each other. When Bronson stood to leave, Harold tried to pay for his coffee. Bronson waved it away. "Coffee's on me," Harold said. "Least we can do." "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, we do." Bronson considered this. "Then pay it forward. Next time you see someone who needs help, help them." Harold extended his hand, firm handshake despite the Parkinson's. "Thank you, Charles, for everything." Dorothy stood on her toes, kissed Bronson's cheek. "You're a good man." Bronson left. Harold and Dorothy finished their pie, drove to their daughter's house, told the story at dinner. Their grandchildren listened with wide eyes, impressed that their grandparents had been rescued by a movie star. But that wasn't the end of the story. 3 months later, Harold and Dorothy were driving through Modesto when they saw an elderly man broken down on the side of the road, flat tire, no AAA, no cell phone. Harold pulled over, changed the tire, refused payment, just said, "Pay it forward." The elderly man was a retired teacher named Frank. Week later, Frank helped a young mother whose car battery died in a grocery store parking lot. Wouldn't take money, just said, "Pay it forward." The young mother was Maria, single parent, 2 jobs. Week after that, Maria saw a homeless veteran digging through a dumpster, bought him lunch, listened to his story, connected him with services, said, "Pay it forward." The ripple effect continued. Dozens of people, hundreds, all because Charles Bronson spent 8 seconds teaching a punk that strength protects those who need protection. All because he showed Harold and Dorothy that decent people look out for each other. Kyle Morrison, the punk, never came back to Murphy's Diner, moved to Los Angeles 6 months later, got arrested for assault, spent 2 years in county jail, got out different, quieter, started working construction, learned what it meant to earn respect instead of demanding it. Years later, Kyle became a supervisor, hired older workers, treated them with dignity. When his crew asked why he was so respectful to the elderly guys, Kyle would tell them about a day in a diner when he learned the difference between being tough and being strong. He never mentioned Charles Bronson by name, just said an old man taught him that real power protects people instead of hurting them, that 8 seconds can change your entire understanding of what it means to be a man. Nancy, the waitress, worked at Murphy's for another 20 years, told the story to hundreds of customers about the day Charles Bronson saved an elderly couple from harassment. About 8 seconds that prove heroes aren't just in movies. The story became legend at Murphy's. Customers would ask to sit in Bronson's booth, the corner table where he'd been reading his newspaper, where he'd decided that enough was enough. Murphy's closed in 1995. Highway bypassed the town. Business dried up, but the booth was preserved, donated to the local historical society, plaque mounted on the wall where Charles Bronson proved that real strength protects those who need protection, 1976. 8 seconds to teach 3 lessons. That bullies are cowards when faced with real strength. That dignity doesn't have an expiration date. That heroes are measured not by their ability to intimidate, but by their willingness to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Charles Bronson never spoke about that afternoon, never used it for publicity, just another moment where he chose to do the right thing because it was the right thing, because it was the right thing. 8 seconds that rippled forward through decades, through Harold and Dorothy and everyone they helped, through Kyle and everyone he treated with respect instead of contempt. 8 seconds to prove that real toughness isn't about making others afraid, it's about making others safe. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the world.